Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Cryptids and Monsters video. Another entry for you here, this one being the last one for this go around, and then as usual I'll give it a pause for a couple of weeks and then start working on some more later on. No worries though, be on the lookout for future videos about urban legends and then the new series The Ghosts and Spirits, and that way it can keep things going on a fresh and continuous basis. This particular suggestion has been there for a while. I guess with regards to my last a couple of entries, I've done some of them where it seems like stuff had been suggested several times. And this one I finally went ahead and I gave in a little bit, only because it is an interesting subject, but at the same time, I don't really want to talk about too much about one end, and you'll know what I mean here in a few minutes. I'll leave that for yourselves to look up the information. But as far as this actual location, it definitely remains very interesting. One of those rare things where I talk about a cryptid and monster actually being a location. And what I'm talking about here is the infamous location known as the Skinwalker Ranch. By far, this remains one of the most, I guess, active locations yet in the United States when it comes to strange, bizarre encounters, crazy creatures that are found. I mean, there's a lot of history to talk about. And for this video, I'm going to talk about a little bit of the early known stuff on the Sherman Ranch, because that was its original name, and then how it came to be known as the Skinwalker Ranch with let's say the new owners and the almost infamous status that they have now. And then just very, very briefly, I'll talk about some of the actual, I guess, cryptids known as the Skinwalkers. That stuff, though, I don't know. I want to leave it a little bit on the side, only because I think that's one of those things where if you know too much about it, that can be a bad thing, and I don't want to go down that area. But at least with regards to the land itself, it is absolutely perfect to talk about because there's a lot of rich history. There's a website, skinwalkerranch.org, that contains really good stuff. I highly recommend it when you have a chance. You'll see a lot of interesting info about this location, and that's where I found most of the stuff here that I'm going to talk about. Let's go back in time to like the early 1900s. The the owners that were there during that time in the early 1900s were a couple by the name of Mr. and Mrs. Mayer, or Meyer, M-E-Y-E-R, I guess is how it's said. And they lived there for a good while, ever since the 1930s. And it wasn't until the husband, Mr. Mayer, died that Mrs. Mayer lived there by herself for 7+ years before finally selling it to her next owner, which was in this case the Shermans. The Shermans are the ones that became kind of infamous with this land, and I'll highlight them in a minute. But with regards to Mr. and Mrs. Mayer, they lived there for a good number of decades, again since the 1930s, and only when she was by herself did she live out the last part of her 7 years of her life there. Whenever the, I guess, time came to sell the property, I don't know if it was because it was the family of the Mayers that were selling it, or if Mrs. Mayers just lived out her life and decided to sell it herself before she died. I didn't really get that info. But there was a very fascinating thing found by the new owners, the Shermans, that I'll talk about here. They purchased the land shortly after, I guess, her death, or before her death. I don't know, it's kind of hard. This was back in 1994, and when they did so, they noticed a lot of curious things from their previous owner, Mrs. Mayer. For example, whenever they first walked into the house, because they thought at the time, these guys, Mr. and Mrs. Sherman, the infamous owners, they thought that they were coming into their dream home. This was a place that they really wanted to live in. It was a huge, huge acre spread that they bought, 480 acres, which is gigantic. And they wanted it to be their place to grow up their teenage son and for their 9-year-old daughter to enjoy. This was a piece of land that they wanted to purchase, I guess, for a good while, and they finally did so. And curiously enough, they were wondering, wow, you know, this place has been listed for quite some time. Nobody ever bought it. They bought it cheap, but they went ahead and took advantage of it, and that way they could live there. It did, again, make them curious as to why that was done. Now, when they came into the house, they noticed several things that also stood out. Apparently, Mrs. Mayer, who again had lived there 7 years before her death, she had inside the house, not outside, but inside the house, giant, heavy dog chains bolted to each of the 4 exterior doors, like each of the doors, I guess, tying up to the outside of the home. And the reason she had this, it seemed, they thought because she had one dog and maybe she would move the dog from chain to chain, maybe as a way to make sure that her being by herself and her being elderly, she has someone to protect her. And at the same time, whatever this dog was, it would not wander off too far away from her in order to continue to protect her. But no, she was later told by neighbors that no, Mrs. Mayer had 4 huge ferocious dogs always on end, chained to each of those doors. That stood out, obviously, because why would you have 4 gigantic ferocious dogs, especially if you're an elderly woman? You probably need just one, but here you need 4. And on top of that, they were not allowed to roam free. They were chained to the doors themselves at all times. I don't know. I mean, that's a bad sign. That's a big red flag for me. If I would have seen something beforehand, naturally you'd be asking, what is going on? Why was this necessary? But they put it out of their minds and they moved in. And again, this was around 1994 that they did so. It was shortly after that, though, that they started to see the things that made their case infamous. Skinwalker Ranch, the most common thing cited about it is it's a location for finding a lot of what can be considered UFO experience. And this is what they saw. They would see large circular things, I guess, moving about through the air. They would see objects, classic unexplained flying objects, as if they were far away, in some cases on the other side of mountains, and in some cases either at night or in broad daylight. They also began seeing circular impressions on the ground itself. They described one as being a circular impression large enough to house a 30-foot triangle in the middle of it. And then they would find other circles measuring 3 foot wide and one that was about 2 feet deep also within the ground itself. And the way they described it, the ones that were 2 feet deep, they were firmly impacted into the ground. In other words, like they were something with enough force severely imprinted on the ground to cause it to go 2 feet deep, and you could actually like touch it, and you could see the force that caused this particular thing. They also started to notice some strange craft again that would go up and around, and it was during this time period that the first mutilations for their cattle was also being found. They, being in an area where they had 400 plus acres to work with, one of the things that they would work on for their careers was raising cattle, which is good. I mean, it's a prosperous thing to do in some cases. And in this case, that's what they chose to do with their location. But doing that, they started to notice these strange cattle deaths occurring. The first cow that they found was not mutilated. Instead, it was just dead. And this was found shortly after what they saw with like a UFO in the far background. But when they went up to the cow, they noticed that it was dead because there was a hole in the center of its left eyeball. That was it. The cow itself was not mutilated in any other way. It was not torn apart like it normally would be if, let's say, it was a wolf, or let's say it was some kind of other large, ferocious carnivore of some sort. No, instead all they found was just a hole in the center of its left eyeball. And the guy Sherman, when he also found this cow, he noted a strange chemical smell in the vicinity. So 2 strange things with this particular cow death. There was a short time later that a second cow was found dead, also again with the same hole in its left eyeball. And on top of that, this time this guy, Mr. Sherman, he took a wire. I guess he had a wire with him, or anything involving large ranches, you have barbed wires to work with. So he found a wire, and he wanted to gauge how far that hole in the left eyeball went. And he took it and he put it in, and the way he measured it until it actually faced resistance, he noted that it slipped all the way into what could be considered the center of the brain. So again, another unusual circumstance. Another time, he finally started having cows disappearing. The way he described it was they just up and vanished. They weren't being found at all. They weren't being found mutilated. They were just gone. In one case, it was snowing at that time in the Sherman Ranch, which again was what it was called before later on becoming the Skinwalker Ranch. And when he did so, he noticed that there was fresh prints of a cow there in the snow. And he followed the prints, and then they just stopped. They just automatically stopped. There was no indication about where the prints of the cow later went. It didn't snow anymore, so it didn't. The extra snow didn't cover the prints, and if it had, obviously it would have covered the previous prints that this guy Sherman was following. No, these tracks just stopped 100% on their own at the edge of a field. Crazy stuff. He noticed that also that there was the last steps were, and this is his quote, surrounded by a circle of fresh twigs and branches which the guy could see come from the trees above. So whatever had happened to this cow, it happened to the point where it forced the cow to stop right then and there, and then whatever it was what happened to be above the trees. So much so that the interaction of whatever that thing was caused twigs and branches to fall from the trees surrounding the cow's area, the last known area of that cow. And then also again, it was during this time period that more crafts, like strange vehicles, were being spotted. He said he saw one that was about 100 foot. What was it called? Yeah, it was about 100 foot in the air or so. It was orange colored, four of them in fact, that he saw. In one case he took like a high powered binoculars and focused in on it, and then that's when he saw even more details. He described it as being a stealthy, smaller craft, being about 60 to 40 feet long. It was squarish with short wings, and it had an accompanying craft, like a second craft next to it. And they looked like they were both flying through some kind of grid. And then on top of that, both of them seemed to emit spikes of light which seemed to hit the ground almost like lightning. I don't know, but at this point, if you're having all of this happen, you have cows being, I guess, left for dead, not necessarily mutilated. You have other cows that are clearly missing. You're seeing strange lights, and then now you're seeing strange aircraft of some sort. It seems like that's it. You know, that's a bad thing. One of the turning points was finding and this time actually a mutilated cow right there when the Shermans were around. Because here's what happened. The cow itself apparently was being tagged with some kind of I don't know what they call them, but they put the tags like on the left ear or the right ears of the cow to ensure that it could be branded in some way, to keep it itself as the owner's property. They just barely finished doing that. Cut to about 5 minutes later, and then that's when they heard something. They heard something strange, and when they ran outside or went to that area of what they heard, they found that very same cow with the back end of it ripped out. They described it as being with like a 6-inch wide hole that was 8 inches deep. Remember, this was just 5 minutes since they've had tagged that cow. So that cow left and wandered to do its thing, and then it went somewhere out of sight from the Shermans, and when it did so, whatever it was attacked this cow, and that was it. That was within a short 5-minute period. And then here's another strange encounter. This time it's getting even more personal. This has to do with the Shermans hearing strange voices. They call them unintelligible voices. There he was, Mr. Sherman. He was with his son. His nephew had apparently come along too, to visit, I guess, inside the ranch, and that's when they heard these strange, unintelligible voices while they were doing some pasture work. The way he described it was these voices seemed to be coming from the air, but not just the air like next to them, but the air above them. He described it as being like about 25 feet is his guess in the air. This is the way he described it. He said as they listened more closely, they could distinctly hear two voices speaking in an unknown language. Terry described it as being choppy, like a cross between Russian and Native American languages. I don't know necessarily what he means by the word choppy. Maybe just cutting in, cutting out. Maybe that's the guess that I had on here. And one voice he noted has a deep resonant tone, while the other voice was higher pitched. And then, as strange as it sounds, the way he heard the conversation or tried to decipher what the conversation was about, it sounded like the voices, were talking about them, about Terry, his son, and his nephew directly below them. And so finally, when he couldn't hold on to it enough, he finally yelled straight into the air, "We can hear you." and then that's when the voices stopped, according to him, stopped, and the one with the lower, deeper tone broke out into a low, rumbling laugh, as if they completely understood what Terry just said. They knew that Terry knew they were there, and they began laughing about it. And then this conversation, whatever it was in that strange dialect, continued on straight as before. I don't know. That's my breaking point there too. If I'm hearing these strange voices and I cannot hear, I mean, I cannot see where these voices are located, and you note that these things are happening, and they seem to be talking about you. They know you're there, and you know that they know that they're there. It's something that's bad. I don't know about that. I would not see that happening. Finally, there seemed to be like a turning point. The last turning point happened to be with the family's dogs. That's when another eerie phenomena started to occur. They called it glowing blue balls moving around the field itself. The way they described the balls were like giant orbs, or small orbs, I'm sorry, but larger than marbles, but smaller than, I guess, like beach balls, anything along those lines. And they were blue, but they were glowing blue, and they would give off some kind of strange crackling sound, like energy sound, and they seemed to be controlled intelligently. In other words, they were just not random, like strange phenomenon floating through the air. No, they would hover, they would glide, they would purposely move from one area to another, and they would move, according to his quote, unbelievably fast. I'm guessing that they could be very far away in 1 second, and then a couple seconds later much closer. And then finally one evening they saw one of these giant glowing blue balls approach their horses. The horses naturally were spooked out of their minds about what was happening. The Mrs. Sherman, she had a flashlight at the time. I guess she must have been nearby. She flashed it. She flashed the flashlight straight into that glowing blue ball, and then it hesitated and retreated, but then it went back again, this time straight towards them. And when it did so, it started to inspect Mr. Sherman, and he that's how he described it. It was as if it was, and this is his quote, inspecting him. He said, in fact, this was, upon closer inspection, he described it as looking like a glass ball about the size of a baseball, but again, emanating that energy like crackling sound, and then with the he described as two blue fluids in and around the ball intermingling with each other. I don't know how one could visualize it, but I'm guessing like a liquid blue of some sort. Who knows? And then that's when he described it as being the most frightening experience in his life, because here you have something you could not explain out of your mind what it is, and yet it's standing and floating right in front of you, inspecting you. And when this happened, his dogs were also around as well. They had 3 dogs there. And whenever it started to inspect the cow, that's when Mr. Sherman, I guess, had the courage to try to get his dogs to follow this particular thing, whatever it was. He ordered them. They were initially a little hesitant to do so. Naturally, dogs, they know when something is bad. They don't want to necessarily be around something that's bad, but they obeyed his master. They went after this giant of blue ball, whatever it was, and they chased after it into an area where they could not see. And when they did so, it was in a wooded area. That's when they heard the dogs yelp. They did that distinctive cry that dogs do whenever there's great harm. And the 3 dogs did not return. So the Shermans did not want to inspect it because they wanted to wait until the next morning. Naturally, with it being night, it could be a bad thing to do so, especially after what just happened and what they heard with the dogs. So the next morning they went to inspect, and then that's when, and around that area, they found 3 what they described as burned circles in the wood. And in the middle of each of these burned circles, they described what looks like a greasy blob of some sort. They described it as being shortening or butter, shortening that stuff that you can use to cook certain food. That's what they described was like these 3 greasy globs in the middle of those 3 burned circles. And naturally they thought to themselves, oh my god, those are the dogs. Whatever this thing was, whenever the dogs gave chase and they went into the wooded area, it attacked them, burned them pretty much alive, or turned them into this, whatever this greasy blob was, but obviously the dogs were clearly gone and dead. So that's when the owners decided to move. That was it. They wanted to get the hell out of there, and they decided to sell the property. This is where things take a little bit of an interesting turn, because the new owner was a guy who was more into purposely wanting to be at that place than anyone else. He's a rich billionaire, a guy that owns several chains of hotels. His name is Robert Bigelow. For example, you're looking at a picture of him now. He owns the Budget Suites all across America. That's his hotel. So he's a guy that's very, very rich. He heard about the history of this ranch and about everything happening with it, strange occurrences, and he's a guy that's actually very fascinated by this, so much so that he founded an organization called the National Institute for Discovery Science. It no longer exists. It actually has been canceled. It operated only from about 1995 to 2004, but it was founded with the idea of trying to take a scientific standpoint to strange phenomena. As it was described by the deputy administrator of the organization, a guy who was hired, his name was Calm Kelleher. He said, "We don't study aliens, we study anomalies. They're the same thing in a lot of people's minds, but not in our minds." And they were basically set up as an organization to study strange paranormal items, but again from a scientific standpoint. So this guy, he bought the property from the Shermans. He bought everything. I mean, the entire package, everything, with the sole purpose of trying to study this place. This guy, Mr. Bigelow, he went ahead and he set up a whole bunch of scientific stuff there at the ranch. One of the first things he did too was he cordoned off everything. It suddenly became almost like Area 51 there, where a lot of things were placed behind fences. There was a lot of security around. You could not get in without passing certain clearance. It became a place where all this research that was going to be done was going to remain hidden. But at the same time, it was done and it was set up with the idea that, again, all this research, if this place was truly as haunted, I'm not haunted, but at least set up with all this strange, in some cases, I guess you could call it cryptid-like, paranormal, whatever activity, then it would definitely be a place that could be studied. So they went about doing that. There's apparently a book that was written about all the experiences there done during a study by this organization. I think it's on Amazon right now. In fact, if you have a chance, it's called Hunt for the Skinwalker. Science Confronts the Unexplained at a Remote Ranch in Utah. And it was written by, again, one of the people within that organization, that guy, Colm Kelleher, and he also co-authored it with a guy named George Knapp. If you've heard of the name George Knapp, he's a big name in the UFO world. It's because he's a guy that also is as adamant as this other guy, Bigelow, and anything related to UFO and strange occurrences and strange happenings. And the both of them got together. He was the only journalist ever invited into that ranch while all this research was going on, and they wrote about their entire experience. It seems pretty fascinating. I'll wait until, I guess, the book gets a little cheaper, because I saw it on Amazon, and I'll wait till I can bundle it with other stuff, and then I might order it. But anything involving the experiences there, whatever has occurred, I couldn't find much information thereafter, but at least with regards to the ranch itself, that's where it's located, and that's who the owners are now. So you can go there today, but apparently it's still cordoned off. You'll run into, like you've seen in some of the pictures, the fences telling you stay away, no trespassing, the usual stuff. And probably like anything involving Area 51, if you even try to cross over, you'll experience the usual stuff involving cars coming forward all of a sudden. So don't really recommend anything like that. Now, the last topic I'll briefly talk about has to do with the Skinwalkers, and that's how the name, the Skinwalker Ranch, came about, how it became known instead of the Sherman Ranch as the Skinwalker Ranch. And the reason for all this is because this ranch is located apparently in an area that has a strong Native American legend. This is an area that has a rich history of Native Americans. They've been there for the longest time, and they themselves knew of the history of this location involving the Skinwalkers. Skinwalkers are a strange phenomenon. They seem to be entities of some sort. I guess you could call them cryptids, but they're not really cryptids. Like they're not like what I just talked about, like the white things or anything else involving some of the other cryptids. They just seem to be like a strange evil force of some sort. They're things that can shapeshift into anything else. That's why they're called like skinwalkers, because they can take and manifest themselves into any kind of skin. They seem to possess people. If you stare at one directly, apparently it'll look right at you and want you to look right at you, because then it'll start actually possessing you at that time. Skinwalkers can also, I guess, like create curses. They've been described as being pure evil. They've been described as turning into animals and going on hunts of people. They've been described as being originating from Navajo witches. They have supernatural powers involving the ability to teleport, to reappear anywhere else. They've been described as like being able to mimic people. They can copy the voices of family members. They've also been described as being able to take the power of certain animals and becoming that power, like being able to fly, being able to run as quick as a wolf, anything like that. So it's crazy stuff. I don't really want to go again too much into that, because anything involving that world, apparently if you know more about it, then it's a bad thing. So I'm going to hesitate on that. There's obviously going to be a lot more info regarding the skinwalkers that's out there in the internet. So if you want to go into that info on your own, by all means, please do so. But this is the most that I'll talk about here. But that's where, though, it became known as the Skinwalker Ranch, because it has to do with the rich history that the Native Americans had there. In fact, there was an interesting article I read that said that some Indians in and around that area decided to play a little game of some sort, where every time there's a new owner within the Sherman Ranch, like the area that was there, they place a bet, like, and they say this person will be out within 2 years. And in this case, the Sherman people lasted just about 2 years, so the bet itself was won. And the reason for that is because, again, with them knowing so much about the history, that is something that they realize it is not a place to be visited. They don't visit it themselves. The Native Americans there, they just stay away from there. But of course, with anything involving land and the idea of setting something up for rich cattle, like the Shermans were planning on doing so, they just disregarded the entire history, even if they were probably told about the dangerous stuff that they were messing with, and instead they just purchased it on their own. But again, it really has to do, the Skinwalker name, with the idea that it's housed, it's an area for all these skinwalkers to essentially hang around. Bad stuff. So, all right. So if anyone has any more info, I'm sure there's a bunch of stuff that's still very fascinating to talk about with regards to the Skinwalker Ranch. If anyone has any more rich, detailed info that I didn't share that they'd like to share here, please post those comments below. It'd be fascinating to hear. And as always, any other information, any more recent, I guess, encounters, that's the stuff I'm looking for. So if anyone has that info too, please post them below. Thanks again, everybody. Take care.